Hi, I'm Ethan Wong, and today I'm here speaking with Mark Irwin. Let's just get straight into the questions. So something I ask all the poets, basically, that I interview is, what to you is special about poetry as an art form that you would pursue it over anything else?
Um, I think because poetry allows me to delve into mysteries. And I've always been more attracted to the ineffable parts of the world, things that can't be explained. My sixth collection of poems was called Tall If. And it's essentially explores the idea that most of our lives don't occur uh, with yes or no, but they occur in an area between those two. Maybe, if, perhaps. And, I think that a lot of poetry is about the subjunctive world, the world we're not aware of. And that's what I'm interested in pursuing. Things that don't have definite answers, things that are complicated and messy.
Yeah, something I feel that something about poetry is that maybe it's the form or maybe it's the kind of tradition of it lends itself to kind of depicting those kinds of things that you mentioned, because maybe you don't have a lot of room to work with, or you don't have a lot of kind of um, the same forward like directness that you have when you write normal prose. And so you end up kind of wrapping around these ideas very much in the way that you're talking about, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between prose and poetry is primarily one of density. Um, you see that in, I think, most vividly in someone like Emily Dickinson. Um, and I think that's an important distinction between prose and poetry, that there's more attention to form in poetry. Um, Both poetry and fiction have form and content, but it's form and density and language, intensity of language that distinguishes poetry from prose.
Yeah.
But there are a number of, great um, prose writers. Um, I was just talking with my friend Arthur Z about this, uh, a Chinese American poet that write like poets all the time. Virginia Woolf would be an example. Um, that Cormac McCarthy. There's such a density, um, to the language that it's poetry. There's a Chinese poet I like very much, Bei Dao. His last
Mm.
name is spelled D-A-O, and there's an incredible intensity and compression and range, historical range. The poems in just 10 lines go from 2,000 years to the present, but then also a wide range of imagery, from animals to fast food to revolutions. So I think that's important to see, that there's a limited space in poetry that's very important, how much you can do in that space. And the more you can reduce that space, the more powerful poetry becomes. It's kind of like, I hate to use the example of an atomic bomb, but when you bombard, plutonium with electrons, it becomes more and more unstable. And poetry is like that. The more dense it becomes, the more it's trying to burst out of the frame that it's in.
That's a really good way to put it, because I had always thought about it in terms of the limits of less words and the lines that you kind of put them in, but I had never quite connected the dots fully to the point of just density and intensity as those kinds of are paired. So I think that's
Yeah,
really what like kind of sorry, that's just like what's at the base of it.
yeah, I was going to say that the word verse, verse, actually comes from the Latin agricultural term versere, versere, which means to turn, so that when you get to the end of each row, you turn. You know, it's a notion of form, even in the agricultural sense. You know, it's an idea of form.
Yeah. So kind of branching off of what you mentioned earlier about wanting to write about the ineffable, I wanted to kind of explore that a little more in terms of, are there ever times where you can pinpoint to things that that really inspire your writing, whether that's autobiographical or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, a good example of that is always death, because, you know, death is something that's, you know, permanent. But because we've spent so much time with these people, you know, they still remain, their spirits still remain. So we're constantly trying to reconstruct them in memory, so to speak. And that's an example of the ineffable, I think. We're slowly making myths out of these people, no matter who they are, you know, so that they will endure longer in memory.
Hmm. Things like that, where you kind of do you kind of draw on your own life's experiences to write those kinds of poems about the ineffable?
I think it's important that writers write about what they know, write from experiences they know. Most of my life, you know, is kind of divided between large cities and, you know, rural areas. I built a house on 5 acres in Colorado, which I consider my permanent home. I'm living in an apartment now here in Los Angeles. I also keep an apartment in Paris. I just rent one month a year. I haven't been able to go there for 2 years because of COVID. But so a lot of what I write is often about the juxtaposition of the natural world and a kind of high-tech municipal world, which is where everyone seems to be moving today. Although because of COVID, there's now a movement called exburbia, where people are moving back into rural areas, I think. So that's you know, that's something that I feel I know about. So I write about the juxtaposition between cities and rural areas, and mortality, maybe, which is a subject, I think, of most poets.
Mhm.
Mortality.
And that's really interesting to me because just talking about it, um, are there ever times where you're like writing based off of your own experiences, but you'll want to include something that you may not necessarily have intimate firsthand experience with in the poem? And if that ever pops up, how do you kind of deal with it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think your question is a good one. I think what raises all literature, and especially poetry, to a higher power is the imagination. So the imagination is that part, you know, that you add to it. If you look behind my left shoulder here, there's a picture of Franz Kafka there. And I've always admired his writing because of the, you know, incredible imaginative quality of it. The famous story or novella, The Metamorphosis, is about Gregor Samsa, who's transformed into a giant beetle. Well, that's one thing, but he attempts to go to work as a giant beetle. And of course, he can't. That's the imagination, right? He clings to things in his room that he knows will be taken from him. That's the imagination. So, you know, I mean, that's what I think raises literature to perhaps its highest power, the imagination. I think the great a philosopher, Saint Augustine, said that memory is the belly of the imagination, that we don't ever imagine anything purely, that we imagine things in part from memory. And I think that's important to understand. Somebody just can't draw a Martian out of the blue unless they've seen some images of things that look like spaceships or Martians. So the imagination, no matter how great it is linked to memory. So memory and the imagination are two vital borders of literature.
Definitely. I definitely agree with that, because just thinking about my experiences writing in the past, a lot of it is, even if I'm trying to get something into the abstract, a lot of it will be because I have either seen something similar, or I kind of write around the things that I have seen in order to make up the things that I haven't. And
yeah, exactly. A quick example would be a line from Emily Dickinson, and then a plank and reason broke. So you have the plank, which is tangible and real, but a plank and reason is suddenly the imagination taking over, because reason isn't made out of planks, but if it is, it becomes very interesting, right? Because reason is often broken or flawed. So, you see the imagination consistently, in Emily Dickinson's poetry. I'm thinking of the poem, there's a certain slant of light, winter afternoons, that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Right away, she's moving into the imaginary, right? Oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Well, that's something we don't think of as a blunt force. It's more but then she says, heavenly hurt it gives us. We can find no scar. So suddenly we're in the world of the intangible now. We've gone from the tangible and the real to the intangible and the imaginary very quickly.
And I guess that would be kind of the density and the intensity,
Exactly.
kind of playing into it again, just how quickly you can shift ideas and how quickly you can express them.
Exactly.
And actually, still kind of on the topic of intangibles and ineffables, when you come to like writing your own work, and you have to, whether it's because you're editing or you're still in the process of writing, you have to self-evaluate maybe a line or a verse. Have you ever formed criteria as to what is good, what gets to stay? Or like, I guess my question is mainly, have you figured out a way to say semi-objectively, I want to keep this line or I want to keep this stanza, as opposed to just kind of going by feel?
I think for me, and I think a lot of writers that I know, the best method, I write something every day, but I try not to look at it. I'll write it, I'll type it up on my computer, and then I put it in a file. And then maybe a month or 2 months later, everything works 2 months behind. I'll take it out and I'll say, oh, that's not right. That's too obvious. Or, so I think, the passage of time allows you to see things more clearly in writing, because when you're writing, you're in the thick of the present. It's like being in a swarm of bees. You're not thinking of anything but getting away. And so it's not till the next day when you wake up, you see these welts all over, and you say, oh, I better put some calamine lotion on, or some aloe. Writing is kind of like that. You need perspective, and the best temporal aspect is probably the passage of time, so you can see something clearly. I mean, so much, emotional amplitude. The best writing, of course, has a great emotional, level to it. We see that in all the great poets. Emily Dickinson, Bay Dow, Walt Whitman, and you have to remember that can be over amplified. So when you look at it after a couple months, I think most writers tend to, dampen things down a little. There's another Latin phrase, ars calaris artum. The art is to hide the art. So it's a way of kind of mildly disguising what you do in a way. You don't want to be too obvious in what you do. Of course, that's why we have the word cliche, because if a word is overused and it's too obvious, it's a cliche.
Yeah. Definitely passing time has helped for me because whenever I kind of put together like a bunch of my old poetry for whatever reason, I'll just be going through it, and then as I look through it, I can see like, oh, I don't like this, or this whole thing needs to be changed out. And it kind of took me all that time just to get to that point.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you may or may not have this perspective yet, but it's like that with, lovers or partners. I mean, you really can't see a relationship until you travel sometimes 300 miles away from the relationship and you're alone, or the relationship ends. I mean, writing, there's the present moment of writing while it's going on, and then it ends suddenly. Sometimes I tell my students sometimes to keep writing after they think they're finished, because you have this emotional energy. You don't have that when you go back to revise. But sometimes if you keep writing, you might push it to some other level. But then it's finished, but you don't see it because it's still kind of shivering in front of you. If you look at it the next day, it's still shivering. 3 days later, it's still shivering. You kind of have to put it in a closet for a while and then take it out of the closet like an old rain slicker. And you say, oh God, there's a big spot on this that you probably wouldn't have seen in the rain, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And if you're ready, we can go into the poem now.
Let's see, a poem. And I'm not sure I guess I should read something with, I'm going to read a really short poem. Maybe I'll read 2 short poems. This poem is only 5 lines long, but I kind of like it because we were talking about abstraction, and we were talking about also tangible things, and this has both of them. The poem is called Toward Where We Are. Now light turns the room a deep orange at dusk, and you think you are floating, but in truth you are falling. And the fall is so slow, yet precise, like climbing a ladder of straw. Now leaning forward, you open your hands that keep opening. Is this what yes feels like? Making a shore where no water was?
Thank you. That was great.
So that poem has some of those things we were just discussing, right? Tangible and intangible things. And I think that's important in poetry. Maybe I'll read another short poem since that was so short.
Yeah.
Here's a poem. I was very close to horses all my life. Well, actually, I'm not going to read a poem about the horse. I'm going to read one about a chimpanzee because this was a chimpanzee I saw in a zoo, and zoos are terrifying places and beautiful places at the same time. And I think there's going to come a day when we go to the zoo and there'll just be a picture of the animal. This is a panda. This is what it looked like. So this is called the chimpanzee. The chimpanzee from another zoo just transported, clasped one hand to the cage, tentatively looking, blinking at jabs of light through trees, before entering the diorama with its unreal grass, each blade like the green seconds crushed within a day's hour. Now the chimp lies in the shape of a comma, a pause in a sentence, having taken millions of years to arrive. What would you do? It stood and looked at dimensionless walls, a veldt pasteled with trees, then suddenly stopped, the way a cliff might, then continued the way a child, too eager, suddenly arrives at old age.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally like. There's this point where it just totally goes from the tangibles into the intangibles, and then that's kind of the moment of a shift, I guess, in the poem. I kind of see what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that the chimp lies down like a comma in a sentence that's taken millions of years, to arrive. I actually went to Case Western Reserve, and Donald Johanson was there at the time, who discovered Lucy, the first human, or Afroafarensis, the chimp that was, in its first human form, human-like form, approximately 3.2 billion years old. And I was actually, a working assistant, and I remember helping, to lay some of those bones out, not knowing, of course, how important this event was. It was just a work study, job, but it began to take on more and more profound significance, of course. Donald Johanson became a very famous anthropologist. Later went to the University of Chicago. I think now he's in Arizona. But it's again, it's about how we deal with time in a small space. And, a chimpanzee who's placed in a fake jungle, a jungle painted on the walls, is both a temporal and a spatial distortion in many ways. And that's what poetry likes to do, distort things spatially and temporally.
Well, thank you for the two great examples of that. And
I'm sure there'd be greater examples from other poets like Emily Dickinson, or, but you get the idea. You get what I'm talking about.
yeah. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, it was a pleasure being with you, Ethan.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. It was my pleasure.